Hello, I'm Lynette Rail from Cornell University. I'm a Ruby developer and have been a core developer for the Samvera community for the past 6 years. I work heavily on questioning authority and Hyrax. So I'm going to start my talk a little bit different today. I usually start with all the details and then move toward a summary, but I'm going to go in reverse order because I have a lot of details and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get through them all. So after the summary, I will go back and do some of the details and we'll just go until I run out of time. So hopefully from this though, you will get a sense of where things are in our drive to enter Hyrax-halla. So calling out earlier this year to have organizations try and remove ActiveFedora from their apps and to refactor those to use Hyrax replacement calls and the Hyrax Wings adapter, which uses Valkyrie to persist to Fedora through ActiveFedora. So our ultimate goal is to use Valkyrie Postgres adapter with our Hyrax apps. So when I was looking at this, I went a few steps further than might have been called for. And I used our USDA ESMIS site, which is currently on the latest release of the Hyrax 2 series. And I'm using this as the test platform to sort of migrate our ActiveFedora objects to be Valkyrie resources and then see what works and what doesn't work, and to fix whatever issues come up along the way in Hyrax. So I've been steadily working my way through the code migration process. As you can see from the chart, the first step was to create Valkyrie resource versions of the work models. And that's actually working pretty solid. So that's why it's all green. And the second part is migrating the indexing, which is also going really well. There are 2 issues that are outstanding at this point, but neither of them are blockers for continuing to move forward with the work. And most recently, I started working with using the new form in order to actually create the ActiveFedora resources from a form in Hyrax. And this is going pretty well. I ran into some problems in my code, but I don't think it's actually on the Hyrax end. I think it's some customizations that we have that are clashing with it. I removed most of the customizations, but I think I missed a few. So everything looks like it's working in when you do it in Hyrax. So that's why I think it's actually doing pretty well. But I do need to dig a little deeper into how sharing is doing and how relationships are doing before I would mark them green. One of the things that happens when you finish the form is it automatically forwards to the work display page. And that forwarding is happening, but when it tries to bring up the display page, it actually raises an exception. And so this is kind of like the place that is the blocker at the moment to resolve that. So you'll see that the rest of it doesn't have any color coding yet, and that's because that hasn't been evaluated. This is mostly things like presenters, search builders, and migrating the other ActiveFedora objects like collections and file sets. So that looks like a lot of work, but I would say that a lot of this has already happened in Hyrax. And so it's more a matter of just making my application use those things. So it's not really starting from scratch. And then there's a section of ActiveFedora references in my application. And I'm not too worried about those either because those same kind of references have already been refactored in Hyrax. So I should be able to follow the exact same patterns in my app. And there are 3 that are in initializers. So that might be a little bit more tricky, but there's only 3 of them. So I'm sure it'll come through pretty well. And at that point, I'll be ready to actually do the test of seeing, can I read my currently existing ActiveFedora data using the new Valkyrie resources? And once I can tick that one off, then I can start the actual migration process, which would be to use the Wings ActiveFedora adapter to read in the data, and then use the Postgres Valkyrie adapter to write out to Postgres. And that'll be when we really see just exactly where are we with this whole process. So that was a lot of information, but it really only tells part of the story. I've been documenting the process as I go. And so this has a link to that documentation. And there you'll get more of the details and even some like steps that you could follow if you wanted to try and do this yourself. And one other place I wanted to kind of point you from a documentation perspective is there's a dive into Valkyrie tutorial that's in the Valkyrie GitHub wiki. And this covers the basics of Valkyrie. So if you haven't looked at Valkyrie at all really yet, this is a great starting point to just sort of get your mind around some of the concepts. And it has some actual hands-on things that you can do to try it out yourself. So when I proposed the presentation, I said I would try to have some benchmarks. I'm not really at a point where I could do like a full-fledged benchmark analysis, but I did do some quick and dirty performance tests. So one of the things that makes it quick and dirty is that I just did simple atomic tests. So on the right, you can actually see what I did to do the create tests and what I did to do save and what I did to do read. And I did it from 4 perspectives: what it's like in ActiveFedora, what it's like with the Wings adapter, what it's like with the in-memory adapter, which should be blazingly fast, right? Because it's all in memory. And then what is it like to do it with Postgres? And so you'll see that the Wings adapter is pretty slow on the save. I basically think this is due to the fact that the way the save works for Wings is that you convert the Valkyrie object into an ActiveFedora object, and then the ActiveFedora object is saved. And then when you want to read it in, you do the opposite process where you read in the ActiveFedora object, convert it to a resource, and then you operate on it as a resource. So what we think is happening is that in that save process, it's actually doing that transformation like multiple times. The link at the bottom is a link to that documentation that I created on our process. And this is the one specific to performance analysis. And at the bottom of that page are some links to the full profiler run for the ActiveFedora save and the Wings save. And so we'll be looking at that to see where actually are these transformations happening, where are they being called from, to see if we can tighten that up, because it really shouldn't be that much slower than doing it through ActiveFedora. So I will say though that these numbers it doesn't bother me too much, because our ultimate goal is to be in Postgres, and all the Postgres numbers really look excellent. So I want to put in a plug for the Developers Congress at this point, because if this is work that you are really interested in seeing move forward, the issues that have been coming up, I've been collecting them together, and at the Developers Congress, we will try and work through those issues so that we can continue to push this work forward. So that link on this page is taking you to the Developer Congress page in the wiki, and you can sign up and express an interest and all sorts of other good things and find out when it's going to happen and how to get involved. So I thought the next best place to start is to looking at how things are different between ActiveFedora and Valkyrie. So the place we're going to start is, what does it look like to do persistence? So to do persistence in ActiveFedora, you just basically call save on the object. To do persistence in Valkyrie, you pass the resource to a persister. So part of the reason for doing that is that you can actually pass that exact same resource to multiple persisters to put it into different data stores. And that's greatly going to help with the migration process, because as I said earlier, our migration process is basically going to be to read it in with the Wings persister, Wings adapter, and then to write it out with the Postgres adapter. So one of the things that happens when you save in ActiveFedora is it does both a write to Fedora and a write out to Solar. So when you call the Valkyrie save, it's only going to write to the data store. So in this case for Wings, that's going to be a write out to Fedora. But we do want to get the indexing happening. So how are the indexing in ActiveFedora and Valkyrie different? So as I said before, ActiveFedora, you just call save on the work and it's going to get written out to Solar. For Valkyrie, you're going to call save on the index adapter, and following a similar pattern to the persister, you're going to pass in the resource, and that's what's going to do the write out to Solar. So that ActiveFedora save is writing both to Fedora and to Solar, whereas the index adapter is just writing, it's going to generate that Solar document and just write it out to Solar. So understanding a little bit about the difference in the sort of process of when you want to modify an object. In ActiveFedora, you want to modify an object, you just write on the object, say workObject.title equals my new title. In Valkyrie, the standard way of doing that is to create a change set, and then you make the change in the change set, and then you sync it back to the resource. So you can actually write directly to a resource, but using a change set gives you two advantages. One is that you can make multiple changes to the resource in the change set before you persist. And then you can check and see, is this a valid change set? And if all the validations pass, then do the persisting. If they don't pass, you don't have to worry about backing anything out because you haven't changed the resource at this point. So to sort of look at the full process, for ActiveFedora, you would make the change and then you would call save. For Valkyrie, you create the change set, you make the change in the change set, you sync it to the resource, then you pass that resource to the persister to save it in your data store, and you pass that resource to the index adapter to save it in Solr. So that looks like a lot, but fear not, because we have transactions in Hyrax. So the actual process in Hyrax looks more like create the change set, make your changes in the change set, and then call the update work transaction. And what that's going to do for you is it's actually going to do multiple steps in that transaction. It's going to set the modify date, it's going to set the upload date, it's going to validate the change set, it's going to sync the change set to the resource, save it, and then it's going to call Hyrax publisher publish, passing that it wants to publish the object metadata updated. And what that does is it's going to call the indexer and then save it to Solr. So this transaction is, roughly speaking, a replacement for the actor stack that would have done this same set of processes. I will say that having worked with transactions now, I am really liking this pattern because every step is nicely isolated out and easy to follow, and you can tell exactly what's going on at any point in time. So the last part I'm going to talk about in understanding the differences is the difference between querying ActiveFedora versus querying Valkyrie. So the most basic type of query that we do all over the place is I've got the ID and I want to get the object for it. So for ActiveFedora, you call ActiveFedora base find and you pass in the work ID. For Valkyrie, it's pretty similar. You're going to do the Hyrax query service find by and you're going to pass in the work ID. So there are many ways to actually do querying of ActiveFedora. It's not just the find. You frequently have ways to call it in such that it searches Solr and it returns an object from Fedora. Also, a really common way to create customized ways of querying the Solr is using search builders. So Valkyrie does all of its searching through the query service. So there's a standard set of methods that are already predefined in the query service. And then if you want to extend that to other things, you define a custom query. And that custom query is the major way of extending the Valkyrie's ability to search. But even the custom queries are going to go through the query service in order to do that search. All right, so that actually brings us to the migration process. And just for a little background, I'm going to describe what our models look like because I'm going to be referring to these models quite a bit in the examples. So we have a pretty simple model. It's not particularly complex. At the collection level, we refer to those as agencies. And then you can have two work types. We have a publication work type and a release work type. So you can have many publications in an agency. And you can have many releases in a publication. Our publications don't have files, but our releases can have many files. So our release and publication are pretty tightly coupled. So when you actually look at the publication in the UI, you can get direct access to the files right from there. But that's not really going to play into what we're going to talk about here. So I won't go any deeper into that. This is what our ActiveFedora base model looks like for the publication. And I will tell you, this isn't even all of it. I had to cut some of it off because I couldn't fit it on there. And don't even try to read it. The point is just to see that there's a lot of stuff in the ActiveFedora base model. But they all break down into sort of like three major components. There's the property definitions that define the metadata. There's the validations that confirms that everything in the model is correct. And then there's some helper methods that we put in. This is our custom code for the helper methods, and that's primarily used for navigation and maintaining that model structure I showed. All of those are actually going to move to different places. So we'll take a look at where those places are as we move through. But the first step you're going to do when you want to create a Valkyrie resource model is to generate the work resource. And just like we had a generator for the ActiveFedora works we would create, we also have one for the Valkyrie resources. So you just call Rails generate Hyrax work resource and you pass in the name. And that is going to generate a whole bunch of files. And the kinds of things that were actually generated are the controller, the metadata YAML. The metadata YAML is where you're going to define what kind of attributes you want in the model. And then the model resource itself, the indexer, a form, and a view. And a good part of those have specs that are generated for them as well. So the generated resource, this is it. This is what the generated resource looks like. And I will tell you the final version is going to look very similar. So the thing I want to bring your attention to here is these two include statements. The schema loader will take the metadata YAML file that we're going to look at in a minute, and it will use that in order to generate the attribute statements that define the attributes for the resource. The Hyrax work has a similar statement in it for the core metadata. And here in the work, in my work, I'm including in the basic metadata and my publication resource. So this is the final version. That's all there is. So that big massive thing we looked at a minute ago all boils down to this. The include publication extras is using a module include in order to handle the extra custom methods that we have. This may not be the ideal thing. It may be better to put them into services, but for right now, as I move through the process, this was the easiest path to continue moving forward. So how do we define the metadata attributes? So again, this is what the ActiveFedora model looked like. And what I've got highlighted here is all the property statements in that model. And this is what an individual property statement looks like. And you can see that the key parts are that it has the property name. It defines whether or not this resource, this particular property is can have multiple values. How do you want to index it? And what predicate do you want to use? And so this is telling us which file it wants to come in. So this is our resource model again, and it's saying we want to do publication resource. So I will tell you that that publication resource YAML file is generated as part of the generator. And you can pass in attributes and it would generate some of the attribute statements for you too. But I didn't in my case because I had a lot of attributes to bring in. And so I just decided I would do them by hand. So it starts out with the attributes being empty. But this is what an actual attribute, the same one that equates to the property we were looking at a minute ago, this is what it looks like. And so what this is going to do by saying this is multiple value and that the type is string, it's going to define the attribute with the name isNy, and then it's going to say the type is an array of strings. The index keys are going to determine what gets indexed automatically. So you won't have to do any kind of indexing to get the isNy TESM key in there. And the form configurations are going to determine how these things interact on the form that gets generated. So again, the form, the new and edit form are going to be generated for this based on what those values are in this metadata YAML file. This is actually really nice because you see all the values in one place. You easily see how the values are being handled. And so updating and following through with this is actually pretty easy. So one of the things that's not covered by doing a direct property to attribute type migration is any kind of relationship that you define using directly contains or indirectly contains. There's not a direct equivalent of this in Valkyrie. So what you do is you define it as an ID. So in this case, we used to have an indirectly contains member of publication. Now I define this in that metadata YAML file using publication ID, And I just define it with the same kinds of definitions that we used previously. The thing that happens here, this is a single value for me. So this is going to have a type of ID and multiple faults, and it will produce the attribute definition saying it needs to be a Valkyrie ID. So then I want to handle all this extra custom code that we had in our ActiveFedora model. And that, again, is where we bring it in using the publication extras. This is just a standard module include. There's nothing fancy there. The types of extra code that we have in our customizations are navigation methods. So if I'm at if I'm in a publication, how can I get its collection? If I'm in a publication, how do I get its child resources? And if I'm in the release, the child releases, if I'm in the release, how do I get the publication from the release? And also, we use it to maintain the relationships between the models. So if you add a publication to a collection, you can add or remove it directly from the publication resource. And the same with the release, you can add or remove it from a publication. And then the other thing we use it for is we have an identifier that holds a slug that is unique across all of our publications. And so I implemented a custom query that allows you to find a publication given its slug instead of its ID. And so this is how we basically handled it. So for navigation methods, those were converted to Valkyrie custom queries. And maintaining relationships between models, I do that through Valkyrie Changesets. And basically the reason I do that is because when I want to set the publication for a release, I'm having to change, especially if it's a move, I actually have to change 3 things. I have to change the old publication, the new publication, and the release. And so I do all of those in Changesets, then I validate all 3 of them together before I do the save. So that allows me to make sure that the change is going to go through before I actually commit anything as a save to any of the objects. And then the last one I already talked about was the publication by identifier field. And for that, I also used a custom query. So the other main thing that you're going to need to do is migrate your custom indexing that you did in ActiveFedora. So in ActiveFedora, you use the generate solar document method. And in Valkyrie, we're using the toSolar method. So this is what the indexer looks like when it's generated. You will see that it has similar kind of includes where this is again getting data out of the metadata YAML file and using that to know what kinds of indexing fields should it create. So it's going to do everything from basic metadata and release resource for you automatically, so you don't have to define those fields. And that's actually similar. We had something similar in ActiveFedora, so that's not a really different pattern. So this is what it looked like in ActiveFedora. Don't bother reading it. What I'm going to tell you is this generate solar document almost exactly matches to the toSolar. The only difference is that because I moved the publication ID, I don't need to do that now. It's going to get picked up automatically from the release resource being indexed. So the next part of the migration process was to explore forms and how the works display. So there is a form class that gets generated for you. And again, I didn't highlight it this time, but you can see it has the same pattern at the top there with the includes. The form fields are going to be based off of what gets defined in that form section of the metadata YAML file. So what's working in forms right now that I have confirmed is working. So the form view gets generated as expected from the metadata YAML file. The required fields are marked as required. The primary fields show up above the fold. So there's, for those who aren't familiar, there's a button at the bottom that says show more attributes. So if it's primary, it's on that first screen. And if it's not primary, it shows up when you click that button. And then also anything that's marked as multi-valued will have a multi-valued link that allows you to add more values. So I didn't point this out, but you can actually have the form be single value and the attribute as it gets stored in Valkyrie be multi-valued. And that definitely is something that's a pattern that can be useful. So it sets when you go into the form, you can set the fields, you can upload files. As I mentioned before, I had a little bit of problems with sharing with users and setting relationships, but again, that might be in my customization and not in Hyrax itself. I just can't say either way because I haven't really clarified that yet. So the last thing that happens is after the form is saved, it tries to display the work in Hyrax. And right now, there's an exception that gets thrown. We're going to be exploring that more to see what's up with that. And that kind of leads me, I actually made it through all my slides, so I'm surprised I had enough time. So this is where I am in my process so far, and I would make a call again for you to come join us at the upcoming Developers Congress, and you can take on some of these issues that I've raised and help us move it farther towards completion. All right, thank you.
Fantastic. And there's links to more information about the Developer Congress in the Zoom chat and in the Slack Connect channel. And Lynette, I saw 2 questions. One was if you have made your wonderful spreadsheet that everyone is very excited about, if that's available anywhere.
Currently, it's only on my machine in an Excel document, but I will be happy to put it out into like a Google Doc so that you guys can have it there.
Great. And then we have a question in the Q&A. A new version of QA has HTTPS instead of HTTP to LOC. This caused problems with already running Hyrax 2.5.1. Could you please possibly add this against Hyrax notes? We found this a tricky one until we found what the issue was.
Yeah, excellent. That's fine. And in the documentation I have, there is a page that is like stumbling blocks and gotchas, and it lists off all the issues that I know about so far, and that can definitely be added in there. If there's an open issue, if you can send me the link to the issue, I can point to that so people get more information.
Great. And if anybody else has any questions, we've got 3 minutes for questions. We've got a question, is the metadata.yaml format documented somewhere?
So in the file itself, I don't know if I can go back to it. Yeah, there we go. In the file itself, it actually has some documentation at the top. So this is what gets generated, and it has this documentation block at the top that tells you what kind of things it's looking for. In my documentation that I created, it actually sort of describes what each of these fields do and how you would want to use it.